Okay, thanks.
We're here.
It's an intimate setting this morning.
Goodness, how are you?
The Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations and Related Programs will come to order. I want to welcome our witnesses. Thank you for appearing here today for this oversight hearing on U.S. engagement in Central America. For many years, this subcommittee has provided funds for our partners throughout Latin America. Without question, we know that what happens in these countries has an impact on the United States. Our economies, our security, and even our health are closely linked. The latest example of this is the outbreak of Zika, the Zika virus, which is spreading explosively in the Hemisphere, according to the World Health Organization. We want to hear from our witnesses about what the administration is doing to address the Zika virus in the region. Our countries are also connected because of migration. This spring will mark 2 years since the crisis at our southern border reached historic proportions. Members of this committee and a task force that I led for the Speaker took notice. We worked together to address the unprecedented number of unaccompanied children arriving from Central America, but we know more needs to be done. According to the Department of Homeland Security, more than 68,000 unaccompanied minors were apprehended in 2014. More than three-quarters of them were from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Another 40,000 more were apprehended last year. One reason these numbers decreased last year is because Mexico stepped up its efforts to apprehend minors from Central America before they reached the United States. In fiscal year 2015, more than 16,000 were detained by Mexico and 13,000 were returned. Compare that to less than 2,000 removed by the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement over the same period. Mexico's increased border security, which the United States has long supported through funds in our bill, is making a difference. While the total number of unaccompanied children arriving at the southwest border went down in fiscal year 2015, there's been a disturbing spike in the last few months. Administration officials have pointed to recent enforcement actions that may help reverse this trend, yet the number of children apprehended in January was still significantly higher than the same month last year. We must do more to address this problem where it starts. I have heard firsthand from leaders of Central American countries that they want their children back. We need to continue to work with these governments to return these children safely and to keep more from making the extremely dangerous journey to the United States. The Central American countries have already taken a number of steps on their own. Guatemala passed a law increasing penalties on human smuggling. Honduras continued to crack down on drug traffickers and extradite fugitives to the United States. El Salvador, which is one of the most violent countries now in the world, has started to implement a broad security plan in its most dangerous cities. These are steps in the right direction, but they require follow-through. The fiscal year 2016 State and Foreign Operations Bill provided $750 million for assistance to Central America, and there are tough conditions on this aid. The countries must show they are improving border security, addressing corruption, and countering gangs, drug traffickers, and organized crime. The fiscal year 2017 budget request includes $750 million in this subcommittee's jurisdiction for Central America. Before additional funds will be considered, the administration must demonstrate how the funds already provided will address the violence and lack of opportunity contributing to the migration problem, and that these countries are meeting the conditions in our bill. Congress and the American people are expecting results. While the United States has a critical role to play in Central America's success, we should not do this alone. Other countries in the region have expertise, such as Colombia and Mexico. We should continue to encourage partnerships between these countries and El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. We also need to ensure that other countries in the region facing their own security challenges, such as Costa Rica, receive our help. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on these very important issues, and I'll now turn to the ranking member and my good friend, Mrs. Lowy, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Assistant Secretary Brownfield, Deputy Assistant Secretary Palmieri, Acting Assistant Administrator Hogan, I join Chairman Granger in welcoming you today. Horrific levels of The news is often dominated by the devastating war in Syria and the resulting refugee crisis engulfing the Middle East and much of Europe. At the same time, but with less attention, we face another deplorable humanitarian tragedy in our own hemisphere. Horrific levels of violence, abject poverty, weak government plague the countries of Central America. Half of the populations live in poverty and 30 to 40% is underemployed. Last year, El Salvador surpassed Honduras with the world's highest homicide rate, a 70% increase over 2014 levels. has the highest concentration of gang members per capita in the region. In Honduras, the military police continue to eclipse civilian police in most law enforcement operations, despite a long history of impunity and abuse by the military against civilians. In Guatemala, a shameless tax fraud scandal robbed the Guatemala people of millions of dollars and finally led to the president's resignation. Yet the country is now led by an inexperienced former comedian with questionable ties to ex-military officials. It's little wonder that more than 70,000 unaccompanied minors tried to flee these three countries and cross into the U.S. during the summer of 2014, and why the numbers of children and families apprehended at our southwest border increased this past fall and winter, a time when numbers typically decrease. Until the underlying conditions driving migration change, I fear desperate Central Americans will continue to believe that fleeing to the United States is not any more dangerous or uncertain than staying home. That's why we have a clear national security interest as well as a moral obligation to address this crisis. There was broad bipartisan support for substantially increasing assistance to the region in last year's omnibus, which is an important first step. Now we must allocate the resources wisely and prioritize good governance, the rule of law, education, job creation, and citizen security. Our response cannot rely solely on U.S. immigration enforcement efforts or those by our Mexican partners. I hope your testimonies will detail how the U.S. will scale up programs in the region and address what can realistically be accomplished this year. Additionally, I hope you will comment on what progress the three countries have made since announcing their Alliance for Prosperity plan. When will we see measurable results on security, justice reform, corruption, and tax collection? I also hope you will address deeply concerning accounts by human rights groups and local media of corruption, human trafficking, and other abuses against those apprehended and deported. To what extent are you working with the Mexican government to increase humanitarian assistance and migrant protection? Are your efforts including rehabilitation, services in the three countries? This refugee crisis is caused by dehumanizing levels of poverty, violence, gang activity, and failed governments. Congress and the administration must work together in a bipartisan manner to build partners on the ground, empower civil society, protect human rights, and defeat criminals. I do believe this can be achieved, but it is going to take leadership, vigilance, and wise allocation of resources. I look forward to your testimonies.
Are there other opening statements? Okay, I'll now call on the witnesses to give their opening statement. I'm sorry. As I mentioned in my opening statement, over the last, we'll start over. Right. Ambassador Brownfield.
Sure thing, Madam Chairwoman, and I will be excruciatingly brief. Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Lowy, members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity. I will skip the first page of my remarks by saying we all understand basically the nature of the challenges that are before us from Central America. We from INL on the security front believe we have developed a three-part strategy to address those challenges. A bottom-up approach to create greater community policing, a top-down approach to produce reforms and professionalization in the rule of law and law enforcement institutions, and operational support for law enforcement in the region. We believe we have programs now that address those issues. the place-based strategy and the 25 sites that are currently underway, what we are working with the Colombian Assistance Program, the Capri Police Training Program based in Panama, Regional Border Police Training, Justice Department's Regional Legal Advisors, CompStat Policing in Costa Rica and in Panama, and vetted units through all of the major problem countries in Central America. We believe they are producing results. Madam Chairwoman, I would suggest that we have, in our opinion, a strategy, programs to deliver on that strategy, and results which we can discuss in this hearing. I thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Now, Mr. Palmieri, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Mrs. Lowy, and the members of the committee for the support that you've given to our shared efforts in Central America to address these underlying conditions. Today's discussion is an essential part in achieving the security, governance, and economic progress that we all collectively hope to see in Central America. The U.S. strategy for engagement in Central America focuses on 3 pillars of action: security, governance, and prosperity. We designed it as a multi-year strategy that complements the 4 strategic lines of action of the Alliance for Prosperity, the plan of the Northern Triangle governments. The $750 million appropriated by Congress in fiscal year 2016 demonstrates the commitment and efforts we have to work with the Northern Triangle leaders to address these systemic challenges. At the same time, we have a responsibility to the U.S. Congress to fulfill the 16 criteria outlined in the appropriations law. We began work already with the 3 governments on an ambitious and concrete plan for 2016, which will help us ensure we meet the conditions for the continued support of the U.S. Congress for the strategy and the Alliance for Prosperity. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Hogan, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Lowy, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the invitation to testify today. I'm grateful for your support of USAID's work in Latin America and the Caribbean, and I'm pleased to update you on our efforts in Central America. I'd like to focus on what USAID is doing to help address the challenges the region faces. We see prosperity, improved governance, and security, which are the objectives of the strategy for engagement in Central America, as interdependent. We know that opening doors to employment and education for citizens, especially youth at risk of gang recruitment, crime, and violence, will bolster our efforts in security and lead to freer and more prosperous societies. That's why our prosperity programs include efforts to support small businesses and entrepreneurs, encourage private investment, train youth in marketable job skills, and improve agricultural productivity. In El Salvador, for example, we've helped 10,000 small and medium-sized companies exceed $100 million in domestic sales and exports and create over 15,000 new jobs, 49% of which have gone to women. And in Honduras, our Feed the Future investments resulted in a 55% increase in incomes for more than 180,000 of the program's beneficiaries, some of the country's poorest people. These efforts to foster prosperity are only sustainable in an environment where democratic values and institutions flourish, where citizens can depend on basic social services, where impunity is reduced, and civil society and the media can play their rightful roles. To that end, USAID's governance programs include help to reform institutions to root out corruption, strengthen civil society's ability to hold governments accountable, improve financial transparency. For example, in Guatemala, we have supported the National Forensics Institute since its inception in 2007. This body is playing an instrumental role in collecting and analyzing the evidence that led to the indictment of the former president and vice president on corruption charges. Ultimately, none of our efforts in prosperity and governance will take root in societies that are plagued by insecurity. As you've heard, the heart of our security work is youth-focused, as we invest in programs that reach those that are most at risk of gang recruitment, crime, and violence. We are using tested approaches in the most violent-prone communities to create safe community spaces, provide job and life skill training, and build trust between police and residents. Already, we are seeing results of our crime prevention activities in El Salvador, where our initial analysis points to a 66% drop in homicides in the 76 communities where USAID targets its programming. This is all the more remarkable given the country's 70% increase in homicides over the same period. To extend the impact of USAID's investments, we are forming partnerships with the private sector. We currently have 60 private sector partners in the Northern Triangle, from whom we've leveraged $150 million in support of our work with at-risk youth and our efforts to increase food security and grow incomes. USAID is well prepared to implement the new strategy, and we are committed to efficient, effective, and transparent oversight of our programs. We use a full range of monitoring and evaluation tools. We're commissioning external impact studies to better inform our development work. And we've established 5-year strategic plans in each of our field offices. In short, we are collecting hard data to inform our future programming so that we can take advantage of what works and introduce new evidence-based programs. In conclusion, we believe that with policy reforms and increased investments on the part of the Northern Triangle governments, coupled with our new and innovative programming, the U.S. government is well poised to achieve success. Thank you, Chairwoman Granger and the committee, for your support and leadership on the U.S. engagement in the Northern Triangle, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Would you go back to, on your statement, what you said about El Salvador and the violence that was happening there, the numbers?
Right. Last year, El Salvador saw a 70% increase in homicides nationwide. Mm-hmm. National police statistics that have been provided to USAID indicate that in the 76 communities where we have active community-level programs for crime and violence prevention, we've seen a 66% drop in homicides in those communities.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that I understood that, heard. Of course, we're very concerned about what's happening and very hopeful about the plans for the Northern Alliance and what's going on there. I would ask that, because this is a very active subcommittee and they're very involved in what we're dealing with, so I don't want to hear from y'all a year from now. You know, I want us to have regular reports, and we can do it in a very informal way, but this subcommittee, like I said, is very anxious to help and can help, and so I would hope that you would take that to heart. I would ask you on the increase. I understand that, but we've heard that recent enforcement actions by the Department of Homeland Security. How is the administration deciding who is subject to removal procedures and what factors are considered? How are these funds involved, or what are you doing with the children who have come across our southern border and in that big rush for 2 years, and what's happening with them and how you're addressing that?
Okay. Do you want to start, and then I'll talk about reintegration?
Sure. The strategy for engagement in Central America looks at getting at the underlying conditions in the region, in the 3 countries of the Northern Triangle, but also to promote greater regional economic integration so we can create the economic opportunities that will keep people in their home communities. And so the program will work in those areas and in those communities that are most vulnerable both to the violence and to the lack of economic opportunity, so that these young people can stay at home in their home communities. With regard to the enforcement actions at the border, I would have to defer to the Department of Homeland Security for an answer on that issue.
I'm going to limit my questions and hope that we can go around. I know those on this subcommittee also have hearings on other committees, so we could do that, and then we'll have more rounds as we could. Mrs. Lowy.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your testimony, and Ms. Hogan, you really answered my questions. And I think it's so important that we keep hearing. I don't want to question your statistics. I don't want to say I wish we can hear more success stories, But I constantly ask the question, how do we break away from the cyclical phenomenon of lack of security, lack of prosperity, lack of rule of law, non-sustainable governance? And to what extent have the Northern Triangle countries improved their governments, reducing levels of corruption? So we give the American people greater confidence that additional funds will be put to good use. What about police reform? Stabilizing neighborhoods, degrading transnational criminal networks. I mean, facilitation, transport, customs and border integration. Let me just stop at that because you mentioned some successes. Can you talk about all the things that we really want to do and give me confidence that some progress is being made?
Certainly.
You could start with corruption in government.
Okay, great. Well, we'll start with the fact that we saw what happened when civil society was supported to demonstrate peacefully in Guatemala, which changed administration with not only the president and vice president, but half of the cabinet now sitting in jail and waiting to have already been indicted and waiting for their trials. The fact that the incoming president has already agreed to the extension of CSIC, the UN agency that's responsible for investigating corruption, I think is a sign that there is that commitment there to really change things on the ground. And in Honduras, also, we have seen the government there put forward something that would provide increased investigative abilities towards corruption charges. So that is a sign of change. The fact that they have come up with their own Alliance for Prosperity and have invested $2.6 billion in the implementation of that plan is another sign of real commitment. And within USAID programming, we've been able to help governments establish better oversight of their financial management systems. For example, in El Salvador, we had a financial management program that helped to provide greater transparency on budget execution, also to develop an e-procurement system that gives eyes on all of government procurements that people can actually see and hold governments accountable for. Going forward, we know that it isn't just government taking the right steps, but it's also empowering civil society to hold their governments accountable, which is why under the new strategy, we'll have the resources available to provide the kind of support that civil society needs in order to gain that kind of traction, to hold governments accountable and to be able to report on abuses when they see them.
We'll take your advice and move on. Just let me say I love to hear success stories, and I hope they continue.
We've got many more to share with you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Just a couple points. First, reiterating what the Chairwoman said, it's really important that you all let us know specifically what's working and what isn't, so we can work together to try to move in the right direction. I really have two questions right now, Madam Chairwoman. One of them is you all talked, and I think rightfully so, about security being such a priority, and without that, Ambassador, I think you cited once President Uribe as saying that you have to first have security, and then you can have a tipping point where you can go on to other necessary, development, et cetera. So let me, when the Chairwoman, and she was chairing this task force dealing with the unaccompanied children, she led a group of us to Honduras and Guatemala. At the time, Honduras was the murder capital, I think, of the world, right? Now, El Salvador has been backsliding. It has hit 6,600 murders, and it's the highest concentration of gang members per capita. It exceeds, frankly, El Salvador now is pretty much at the same situation where it was during the civil wars of the 80s and 90s. And so
in El Salvador, in the middle of their civil war. First, success story, Mrs. Lowy. Honduras homicide rate is down, depending upon whose assessment you use, between 25% and 30% over the last 2 years. And we will not claim full credit for that, but I will insist that we get at least some acknowledgement and recognition. El Salvador has been moving in exactly the opposite direction, Congressman. One theory as to why is that several years ago, the previous government of El Salvador reached an accord with the organized gangs of the big cities of El Salvador, specifically San Salvador. It produced short-term results and a dramatic drop in violent crime and homicides. The truce no longer is in operation. It has surged. Skeptics at that time suggested that what the gangs were doing was using a period to rearm, reorganize, and recruit. I won't take a position on that. I offer that as a possible explanation as to why El Salvador and not the others.
I would just add that the Salvadoran government itself has developed this Plan Segura, which identifies the 50 most violent communities and the 11 priority communities where they are going to be investing resources. And we are aligning the assistance that we are receiving to try to make an immediate impact on that homicide level in those 11 priority communities.
Madam Chairman, just very briefly too, in the Appropriations Act, and this is a different issue, we establish conditions on aid to Central America, and we also are further report on economic investment conditions, and commercial disputes between the United States is also required. But I'm particularly interested in these provisions about these disputes because I'm aware of a number of U.S. citizens with claims against, for example, specifically the government of Honduras. One of those companies, a cement plant, CEMAR, in Honduras, which was expropriated by the government, and they've been seeking remediation for many years, and it's been, frankly, met with relentless bureaucratic, just dead ends. So I really would like to know how the Department of State and USAID intend to assist that one and other U.S. citizens to resolve such disputes, and how you're monitoring what's going on, and et cetera, because it continues to be a serious issue.
We agree. We have to be active in protecting U.S. American commercial interests in these countries, and we are. Under the CAFTA process, there is a dispute resolution process that is available to investors. And in Honduras specifically, we also have a bilateral investment treaty that they can avail themselves. With regard to the specific case that you've raised, the United States cannot insert itself directly into the judicial process of Honduras. However, we do continue to vigorously advocate for those interests of U.S. businesses in Honduras. And in the specific case, we have encouraged Mr. Serna to avail himself of the arbitration and dispute settlement mechanisms that are available to him.
And my time is up, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lee?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair, Ranking Member, for this very important hearing. And thank you all for being here. I wanted to follow up on a couple of things as it relates to the Northern Triangle. Last year, some of us visited Panama. We were with the President at the Summit of the Americas. It was a bipartisan delegation. We had the opportunity to meet with primarily all of the heads of state from Central America, and barring none, they thought that normalizing relations with Cuba and engagement with Cuba would help our overall efforts in Central America. So I wanted to ask you, has it helped, and if so, how? Secondly, with regard to the United Nations, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees indicated that 82% of women and girls that the U.S. government interviewed in 2015 from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico for expedited removal were able to prove that they have a significant possibility of gaining asylum and protection under international law as a result of the threats they face in their home country, specifically sexual assaults. We, I guess, appropriated some funding to address sexual violence, narcotics control, all of the issues that we need to really focus on. And one had to do with Guatemala in terms of their policy of creating sexual assault units. And so I'm wondering, do we know much about these sexual assault units? Has there been progress addressing sexual assault? And if so, good, how's it working? If not, what do we need to do to make sure it's dealt with?
Thank you very much for your question. In fact, USAID has invested quite heavily in gender-based violence reduction. In El Salvador, we have 22 centers for victims of gender-based violence where they can receive psychosocial support, legal assistance, alternative dispute resolution, and even job skill training. We also have 12 centers for the prevention of gender-based violence because we know that it is one of the lead causes of violence in the home in terms of youth then going on to perpetrate violence and crime outside of the home. In Guatemala, I worked there in the early 90s, and then we were just starting to transition from the old system of justice to the new oral transparent system of justice. I was able to go back and visit just last year, and now we have a 24-hour court that's established with a special center there for domestic violence crimes. And in that center, again, 24 hours a day, they have investigators, prosecutors, and a judge on site in addition to a full medical team and social service providers. That model has now been recreated 8 times over in Guatemala, and so throughout the country, women are now getting access to immediate support from government when they are victims of crime.
Cuba, shift in dynamics in terms of our relationship with Central America countries.
It's clear that the countries of Central America view the present decision in a favorable light. However, for them, they have focused on their relationship with the United States, in particular, the efforts we are making to work with them to address these underlying conditions that spur undocumented migration from their countries toward our southwest border. And in that respect, their priority is a close, productive, and strong relationship with the U.S. government. And they do plan to work with us to meet the specific conditions that are outlined in the legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Dant.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and good morning. Over the past several years, my district and many others around the country have seen a dramatic spike in heroin use. In fact, my local law enforcement has told me, they told me this at a hearing I held, or a briefing I held several months ago, that the heroin they seized, most of which is being brought in from Mexico and Central America, is of increasingly higher potency and being sold at lower and lower prices. In fact, they even told me that the heroin they've seen in eastern Pennsylvania is the most potent anywhere in the country. What factors can you point to that would explain the significant increase in heroin supply and how the State Department's responding to those particular factors? And maybe Mr. Brownfield.
Let me take a bite at that one, Congressman. And half of my answer is a matter of domestic politics, domestic law, domestic enforcement, but it all makes sense. In this case, supply is following demand. The argument, which I believe is a good one, is that over the last 20 years, we created the demand by overuse of prescription opioids, largely painkillers, which developed a dependency or an addiction, which produced a demand for the opioid, and now the heroin market is meeting that demand at a cheaper cost than it would be for the users, whether in Pennsylvania, Florida, or Texas. They can get a heroin dosage at about 1/4 of the cost as it would be from.
That's
from
entirely
prescription
true
opioids.
where I live.
So that's the starting point. Then what I assess, and we can have a conversation about this, is that the overwhelming majority of the heroin that is now entering the United States is coming from Mexico, not from Colombia, and for the most part, not from further down in Central America. Therefore, the impact is much more at our southwest border, much less in Central America itself. That said, is there heroin that is being produced in Guatemala? Yes, a small percentage of what you see in Mexico, but some. And is there heroin still being produced in Colombia? Yes, and it must transit the Central America corridor to get there. But the percentage is tiny compared to what is coming in from Mexico. And to conclude, early next month, I hope to join a group that will be led by the Director of National Drug Control Policy of the United States, Mr. Botticelli, to talk to the Mexican government on next steps and what further we can do to address this crisis.
Yeah, thank you, because it's obviously this is a national issue. It's everywhere, and all the deaths in my district in recent months due to drug overdose for either heroin or synthetic drugs. I mean, that's virtually 100% of the deaths. My second question is this. Many of us on the subcommittee are watching with cautious optimism the mission to support the fight against corruption and impunity in Honduras, and I don't know what that acronym is. MASI, okay. It begins its work in investigating corruption and impunity in the country. So while we hope this new organization will be as effective as the CSIG, that's been very successful, I guess, in Guatemala, there are obviously some different challenges in Honduras. What are some of the primary obstacles facing MASIG, and how can the United States help them be successful in bringing real reform to Honduras, particularly regarding the illegal expropriation of private property?
Thank you. MASI will, first is an agreement between the Honduran government and the Organization of American States. We and other international partners will need to support it with funding, and we look to be able to do that. But the critical elements for its success is it must have the independence to operate with its partners inside Honduras. It must have the ability to signal and highlight cases that are not moving forward and should move forward. And the Honduran government has pledged itself to working in a constructive manner with MASI in that area.
I'll just add one additional comment, Congressman. The head of CSIG, Ivan Velasquez, is in town right now. I've had a recent conversation with him. I wouldn't be surprised that several others around this table have as well. What Mr. Velasquez has said is that there are two keys to success of a CSIG or MASI type organization. One is independence from the government, which is to say he gets to pick his own personnel, make his own decisions in terms of cases to investigate. And second, the authority to actually proceed on cases. In other words, he does not have, the government does not make the ultimate decision. And what he has said to me is examine those two issues as you figure how we will work with MASI in Honduras in the months and years to come.
Thank you. I see my time's expired.
Thank you. Mr. Ruppersberger.
Sure, yeah, I guess First thing, I think last time I saw you, you were the ambassador in Venezuela. Was Chavez who was giving you a hard time or wouldn't talk to you, or what was?
The greatest 3 years of my life.
Well, I see you survived, and now you're assistant secretary, so it was all worth it, I guess. First thing, I want to make a statement. I think that our country has really not focused on two areas, the South America, Central America, and the crime and drug situation there. We put so much emphasis in other parts of the world, especially the Middle East, and it's amazing that you've been able to do what you've been able to do, all the organizations, and that includes DEA also, who has very little resources. Now, I want to talk about, one of the issues I do want to talk about is the issue of corruption and police corruption and the corruption in politics and extortion. And it's my understanding there was a newspaper in, I think it was Honduras or whatever, that said that the corruption paid by the government to these gangs, organized crime, mostly drugs, were close to $300,000 a year sometimes, I mean $300 million a year. I'm wondering if that is a true statement, and do we have the government itself? We know there's corruption dealing with that. The other part of my question will be the special group I think you referred to, the special anti-corruption group that is in different parts of I think Honduras, I assume Guatemala, and if you could just talk about those two issues, the crime, the extortion, what we're doing about it, and is it still pervasive there? Because in the end, unless the public have confidence in our elected officials and our police, especially our police, you're going to have that atmosphere that there's not a lot of trust.
Congressman, here's my 30-second assessment. There are two driving factors that are creating a vast amount of corruption in Honduras and, quite frankly, throughout the Northern Triangle. First are the organized the transnational criminal organizations, largely drug trafficking, they are professional criminals and their objectives are economic in nature. And the second are the criminal gangs. And in fact, the gangs that you see in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala are the same gangs many of the same gangs that you see up here in the United States of America. There is no question whatsoever that those two criminal institutions are penetrating and corrupting all three of the governments of the Northern Triangle. I'm not going to parse words in terms of how many dollars are represented in terms of that corruption. I acknowledge that in all three of the governments, it is substantial at many different levels. What they are doing now to address them in both Guatemala and more recently in Honduras is establishing an organization, CICIG or MASI, to both investigate and bring cases against those in government who have been corrupted. They are also developing law enforcement organizations to both investigate and prosecute those crimes. There are TAG or anti-gang units in all three of the countries, and there are in fact law enforcement units that are vectored on corruption. My conclusion would be to suggest to you that it has taken the region decades, if not centuries, to get into this situation, and we have to acknowledge it's going to take some time to get out of it.
My time is almost up, but I do want to say that you know how successful the program has been with the FARC and in Colombia, and you were an ambassador in Colombia also. What did you learn in Colombia that you might be able to use in this area?
Yep. If we had 10 hours, I could probably fill them all. Let me offer 3 or 4 of the biggest hits. I come from West Texas, Madam Chairwoman. We have very few people out there, so we talk a great deal. First, you have to concentrate on your law enforcement organization. In Colombia, that was the CNP, and literally during a 10-year period, they expelled thousands of officers for corruption. There has to be an internal mechanism that purifies your own institutions. Second, you have to have programs that are in it for the long term. You cannot hold them to a standard of eliminating corruption in 3 months, 6 months, or even 3 years or 6 years. You have to assume that it is going to take time. Third, you have to have consensus within the government, and that means all 3 branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, that in fact you will spend the resources and the time to accomplish it. Those are 3 that would come right off the top in terms of how to make long-term progress against corruption and impunity.
And you do need resources and money.
Without a doubt.
Yeah, and if I could just add on that point, the Honduran government itself, modeled after the Colombia experience, has put in place a security tax so that they can raise the resources that they need to undertake some of these reforms. And as part of the Alliance for Prosperity, as Ms. Hogan mentioned previously, they're the 3 governments investing $2.6 billion of their own money in 2016 to match the $750 million you so generously appropriated in the 16 budget.
Thank you. Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe it was you, Ms. Hogan, in your testimony mentioned the word turning point. Have we seen a turning point
Is his mic on?
of governance in the Northern Triangle, those 3 countries, whereby we can anticipate? Have we seen a turning point whereby we can anticipate a stability of governance that will manifest itself in measures of societal well-being, decrease in violence, economic opportunity, decrease in migration?
Thank you for your question. I'm an optimist. I think you have to be to work in this field of development, but I truly believe that this is a historic moment in Central America whereby these governments are standing up and taking responsibility for their problems, investing their own resources in trying to address these problems, and looking to the United States and other donors for strategic partnerships.
Okay, how does that happen? Is it through an awakened leadership? Is it fatigue with the violence? Is it our input? Is it other bilateral partners' input? Tell me why this trajectory is coming about right now.
I think that, well, I would say
you think
yes
the
to all of those
trajectory is
things.
real?
I would say yes to all of those points. I think the tipping point was what we saw happen in Guatemala, where through this independent investigative unit called CICIG, they were able to bring cases to public's attention that were so egregious that civil society stood up and said, we will not tolerate this any longer. And that, coupled with hard evidence by CSIG, and additionally an empowered public prosecutor's office, as well as a special high-impact court that oversees these trials, again, which were the beneficiaries of U.S. government assistance. I think that was the tipping point, and I think Honduras sat next door and said, we see this wave is coming towards us, we want to get ahead of it. And then they, in fact, established their own similar investigation.
What are your projections in regards to how we're going to see real measurements of outcome in this regard? It's murky right now. The violence is still very high. There is migration waves still coming, even though they're lesser, and the economic problems are not clearly resolved. So give a timeline if this trajectory continues.
It's hard to give a timeline. As my colleague said, it's not going to happen overnight. But one of the things that we have seen is that when we have all hands on deck in a community that is very violent, and we help these communities take back their communities where they frankly haven't had any safe space in which to operate, it's street by street, block by block, and community by community. It's very labor intensive. But because we've been able to show success in the communities where we're working in terms of the reduction of violence, these governments have said, we see what's working, we want to invest our resources in scaling that up. And that is what Plan Seguro is in El Salvador. It's taking that model and bringing it to the 10 most violent municipalities to scale up our intervention.
Let me tell a quick story. I had the chance to visit in Guatemala as well as Honduras fairly recently. There's a little town called Dos Caminos, Two Pathways, where there's a project underwritten by the International Agriculture Corporation, Cargill, which provided the seed capital for the formation of a bakery that is run by women. The organization CARE, along with, I believe it's some shepherding through the Feed the Future program, provided the ongoing technical assistance. It is an amazing transformation to see this bakery flourishing, the women who are involved excited. Just years before, they would have had a subsistence, not in poverty, not in starvation, but in what I call a benign poverty. One of the women had lost her husband 3 weeks earlier to the violence, but all committed to this vision of empowerment through this small little economic project. It was very encouraging to see, and obviously this is the type of thing we want to scale that involves the full partnership of the private sector, which ultimately has to be the longer-term solution here. But my time is nearing to be completed. But are we going to have another round, Madam Chair?
Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To the witnesses, thank you. It's an important issue. I'd like to come to something that my friend Mr. Diaz-Balart mentioned, and I want to go through this quickly. But it's worth, I think, emphasizing and using this as an illustration of a concern that many of us have. And that is this individual, Mr. Serna, who some of you mentioned. Look, the challenges down there are meaningful. We get that. There's drugs, there's violence, there's kidnappings, there's gangs. And how anyone would have economic opportunity in that environment is remarkable at all. But the only hope for the individuals there, for the families, is if there is some economic activity. They have to have hope of a job and some type of future. This in an environment that is very violent and very difficult to do. But it's much more difficult if the federal government is making it worse instead of better in some circumstances. And in some circumstances, they are. And I think that this individual is an example of that. You will not have foreign investment if the investors don't feel like there's respect for the rule of law. If they don't believe that they can go in there and protect their investment, and in this case it was meaningful investment, as is in many circumstances, tens of millions of dollars. And the federal government there essentially acted as, well, they used their power to expropriate this business from this individual as they have in other circumstances, essentially using their power to tax and their power to threaten prosecution. And I wish you could, any of you, if you would, could you assure us that you are doing everything you can? Because you can't sway the gangs down there, but you can have influence over the federal officials. And I just need some assurance that you're doing everything in your power to create that rule of law, an environment that would allow people to go down there and to try to make investments that will help the people down there.
Yes, Mr. Stewart, the top priority, one of the top priorities for every U.S. embassy is to assist American citizens and to protect American investment overseas. Our embassy has been engaged in Mr. Cerna's case since 2002. It has a long judicial process that it has been subject to.
That is indeed very long, because that's going on 15 years now, 14,
yes,
15
yes, it
years.
is. There are arbitration proceedings that are available for the settlement of that dispute, which the Honduran government has offered to Mr. Cerna in the past. But more importantly than the specific case, as part of the conditions in the legislation, we are working with the governments to ensure that they are working toward resolving commercial business disputes and putting in place new strengthened rule of law procedures to protect foreign investment.
Well, and they just have to. I mean, this example, 15 years now into it, and in an arbitration, which is going to result in not a fair deal in my mind. I mean, no one would look at that and say, well, that's good. I'll go down there and invest $30 million in a business. And the government may help take that from me, and 15 years later, I may be in arbitration. I mean, no one's going to look at that and say, that's a good place to go down and be. And once again, I don't mean to lecture because I know you know this, if there's no economic viability, there's no hope for this region. They have to feel like there's hope for their kids to get a job where they can sustain a family, and you can't do that without capital investment. So.
And that's exactly right. They have to create the conditions for foreign
That's
direct
right,
investment.
and that's true in anywhere in the world. And if I could very quickly I can't see the clock, a few seconds I have. There's a bit of a talk about a kind of a Central American spring, if you will, the protests in some of these countries where people are actually beginning to push back. Very quickly, are you optimistic? Is there something there we can look at and say, this is good, this might help?
I think what we saw in Guatemala was historic. It was youth, students, private sector, civil society coming together, using social media platform and using this external entity to really demand accountability. And it was successful in Guatemala. I think it is not just a wave in Central America. I think it's throughout the Americas that we're seeing this. And I do think it will continue to yield results. And in Honduras, the agreement with the OAS to establish MASI reflects the need for some external help to get and move forward on these corruption and transparency issues.
And let's hope so, and let's facilitate that if we can, and encourage and support those people, as they're in a very difficult circumstance, but showing remarkable courage, in my opinion. So thank you.
I'll start a second round and say I want to appreciate all the members of the subcommittee for staying. I know you're very busy, and we're using the time, I think, very wisely. I want to ask you about the $750 million that the Congress funded for FY 2016 for this three-country alliance that's come together. I'm very concerned because I worked on Plan Colombia, and it took years. And no one thought it wouldn't take years. I mean, there was that sort of commitment. $750 million in 1 year. How is it going to be used? Where does it go? Because we said from the very beginning this will be a multi-year effort, and not putting a multi-mean 3 or 4 or whatever. But I'm concerned about that enormous amount of money in 1 year and how it can be used effectively. Thank you.
I'd like to begin to answer that question for you. Madam Chairwoman, we did not wait for the appropriation to get started in planning on how we would use those resources. In fact, as early as the fall of 2014, after we saw the spike and we knew that the administration was going to ask for increased resources for Central America, USAID got started. And so we have been designing programs over the last year to 18 months in anticipation of these resources. And in fact, we have a very aggressive procurement schedule this year. We expect to obligate up to $490 million in new activities across the 3 pillars of the strategy before the end of this fiscal year. And our goal is to live within the pipeline standards of our agency so that we are good stewards of those resources. We spend them wisely, but we spend them quickly because the need is so great, and we think we've got the right procurement instruments in which to put those resources.
Thank you.
And if I can add, Madam Chairwoman, on the Inkle side of the House, and you will recall of that $750 million, we come out about to $1 for every two and a half that went to the USAID accounts. So what we are looking at for this year is somewhere in the vicinity of $170 million, which was our 15 appropriation now coming online for us. I would say the same thing as Beth. We are starting on programs that are already there. We're not starting at point zero. We have been involved in CARSI now for 6 going on 7 years. We want to reinforce some of the justice sector, police reform, and border security programs that we believe are delivering value and have been for more than 5 years. We also want to do something new, which I can use 15 seconds to say is the place-based strategy, where in an unprecedented historical manner, USAID and INL are working together, community by community, barrio by barrio, in terms of developing an objectives-driven, comprehensive approach in the hardest, toughest areas in the region. And I would hope, Madam Chairwoman, to be able to deliver you clear evidence of results, positive, I hope. If negative, then we'll figure what we need to change.
Thank you very much. I'm going to change to Costa Rica now. I just got back from Costa Rica a very short time ago. And looked at the security challenges of that country. I went because of the number of Cubans that were going through Costa Rica, primarily from Cuba to Ecuador. The fiscal year 2016 appropriation bill provided for increased funding for Central America, the Regional Security Initiative. Some of those funds should be used for Costa Rica. Assistant Secretary Brownfield, how is the State Department planning on supporting Costa Rica, and specifically what can be done to help their Coast Guard, which is very limited, but help them with drug interdiction at sea and the security forces to increase border controls? They said there's a light that shines on Costa Rica because of the Cuban migration through that country, but they were much more concerned about human trafficking and drug trafficking that's going through Costa Rica, and how their limited Coast Guard and our Coast Guard can address that.
Madam Chairwoman, your assessment and our assessment are not at all surprising, exactly the same. First, our approach in terms of the total Central America INCL budget for the last 5 years has been about 2/3, 60 to 65% goes to the Northern Triangle 3. The remaining 1/3 to 2/5 goes to the remainder of Central America. Frankly, 3 of the 4 remainders in Central America we have almost no program at all in Nicaragua. That would remain the same, but we have surged, as you well know, since you approved it, the total amount of funding available for Central America. I am therefore hopeful, in fact, I'm not hopeful, I am certain that we are going to increase by nearly 100% the amount of program INCL funding available for Costa Rica. What do we propose to do with it? First, we want to reinforce some programs that are working. CompStat, which is the computer-driven statistics that allow the Costa Rican police to put their personnel where they are most needed, is a winner. Supporting, training, and developing border guard capability, which in turn controls to some extent the movement of other populations across their southern and northern borders, has been a winner. The Capri Police Training Program, which is headquartered in Panama, but in fact provides regional training to, among others, the Costa Rican National Police, is something we want to support. Their anti-gang program called GREAT is worth some effort. Maritime is the area that is going to be new in this coming year. I have had several conversations with the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard is prepared to put assets there. We are prepared to support them in terms of maintenance support and building docks to help them control and use those assets. I hope to have a good story, which I will tell you as often as you are patient enough to hear in the course of this year on Costa Rica.
I'm not particularly patient, but I will listen. I'm a former teacher, so I'll give you an A on that answer. Ms. Lowy.
I'm not a former teacher. But as you can see, and our chairwoman has said this many times, we have on this committee people who are really committed to the work you're doing. And I couldn't help but think, Mr. Fortenberry, when you talked about this enterprise that was empowering women, I remember seeing this in many places in the world, and I still get excited after 25 years of seeing some of the success stories. And I must say, Madam Chair, when we have the caliber of people such as this, it gives me hope. In between the times that I'm very depressed that we can't move more quickly in solving these problems, but I do want to thank you for your years of service, and I would hope that we can see more success stories such as that. And it's interesting because I can remember them. Remember one I saw in Arusha, Tanzania, Land O'Lakes, a wonderful project where they were empowering women and how the women stand taller, feel empowered, take charge, work and raise their families. However, I want to ask a question that's not related to all these good comments we're telling you. If you could explain the administration's decision, on the one hand, to expand the number of Central American refugees permitted in the country, recognizing the dire conditions in the Northern Triangle, while at the same time increasing deportations of families. You may tell me that's someone else's job, but I'd like to hear your response to it, and if you have any input.
Yeah. Excuse me. The administration's effort in Central America is to ensure that there's safe, legal, and orderly migration from the region. Undocumented migration through the region, through Mexico, leaves people to being exploited, potentially trafficked, assaulted in many different ways. The administration has set up a Central America Minors Program in the region that allows minors to apply for refugee resettlement to the United States if they have a legal relationship with a person who can apply for them, sponsor them in the United States. With regard to the removals, the Department of Homeland Security has stated that those removal orders are based on final orders of removal after individuals have exhausted all of their claims for credible fare and refugee status.
Well, I just want to say it's causing tremendous turbulence in our communities, and that's probably not your direct role. I just thought I would get it out there. So thank you again for your service. We all look forward to hearing more success stories, understanding how challenging, tremendously challenging this is. Thank you.
Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. As you all, I'm sure, know and have seen, this subcommittee chaired by Mrs. Granger is very, very, very good at asking for specifics and, frankly, less concerned about rhetoric and speeches. So let me just throw out one specific first, because the question came up about Cuba. Since the establishment of relations, there's been about almost a 90% increase in Cubans fleeing the island and coming to the United States based on the increased repression. And it's been particularly difficult on Costa Rica. I want to thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for going there and for meeting and seeing that firsthand. Those are some facts which obviously are not in dispute. So, Mr. Brownfield, you mentioned that you think is about a 100% increase of what you can of assistance to Costa Rica. I think it would be important if you keep us informed as to specifically how you're doing, what you're doing, and how whatever it is that you're doing is working because Costa Rica has this additional challenge of not having a national military per se. They obviously have a national police. So if you could just keep us informed as much as you can on that, I think that would be helpful.
Will do. I make that commitment, Congressman. And you're correct in your assessment. Costa Rica has always been perceived in Central America as the exception to the rule, kind of the Switzerland located in a difficult neighborhood. And the truth of the matter is they are now encountering many of the same concerns, problems, and threats that the rest of the region is.
Secretary Palmieri, going back to the issue of the SEMAR issue in Honduras, as Mr. Stewart mentioned, in response to you talked about that you've been involved, the embassy's been involved for 15 years. That's a pretty good example of something that hasn't worked. In other words, if for 15 years a U.S. embassy has been trying to help and it hasn't worked, we got a problem. So I would tell you, and again, going to how this subcommittee works, let me tell you what I expect, and I think what most of us expect. Right now, this subcommittee has put forward almost $1 billion. We expect the U.S. government to exert leverage when it's time to stand up for the interests of the United States and also for property rights of American citizens. So I would tell you with all due respect that the issue of, the embassy referring these individuals to a process, this has been going on for 15 years. So what I would ask specifically from you, sir, is I think all of us would ask, and you've seen that there's great interest. We're talking about property rights issues here. And again, if we don't solve that, you can kiss all the $750 million goodbye. So if you could please get back to us, not on, bureaucratic answers about where we've referred them to. No, what specifically, how are we going to exert, and now that we should have additional leverage to make sure that our interests and that property rights interests are actually followed. So what I would respectfully ask for you is tell you that, answering that the same stuff that we've been doing for 15 years is just not acceptable. And so how are you going to use that? And I don't want an answer from right now, but I expect an answer, a specific answer as to how we're going to exert leverage, in particular additional leverage, to protect the interests of Americans and property rights, et cetera, if you would.
Very happy to do so.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much. Let me just comment with regard to Cuba. I think we've seen, and my colleague and I disagree, but I think we've seen over 50 years of a non-engagement policy with Cuba. That hasn't changed one thing. So it's time to at least have normal relations and dialogue and in the embargo. Perhaps through normal diplomatic relations, some of my colleagues' goals could be accomplished. Let me just say to Mr. Brownfield, I too come from the Southwest, El Paso, Texas.
As did my mother.
Okay. Born and raised there, my mother born and raised there, my grandfather, first African-American letter carrier, spoke fluent Spanish. Border town of Juarez. And we know what has been happening in Juarez for many, many years now. I don't know if you would consider the decrease in murders and kidnappings a success story or a partial success story, but could you kind of tell us how you see what is taking place in Juarez? Secondly, and as it relates to El Paso, because I know El Paso was one of the safest cities in the country, in the United States, yet Juarez was one of the most violent. And so it was a very interesting period where those, the most violent and the safest city were side by side. Secondly, just with regard to the drug crimes and the drug trafficking, unfortunately, the African-American communities of color have been dealing with drug issues and not the lack of rehabilitation and drug treatment services for many, many, many decades. Remember Iran-Contra, remember mass incarceration. And so it's unfortunate now that other communities are dealing with the drug epidemic. But I'm glad to see a shift, finally, from locking people up, because they use drugs or dealt drugs, to finding some sort of rehabilitation and alternatives, because we don't want any community to experience what the black community has experienced, which has wreaked havoc in our lives. So, and we know where it started. And so the drug interdiction and dealing with these drug gangs in Central America is extremely important. And so I would like to just kind of know how you see now versus 20, 30 years ago, your efforts to try to stop this drug trade.
Let me offer a couple of comments on both of your points, Congresswoman. First, what is, I'm delighted to talk about what is, because in a sense it represents an example of what USAID and INL, what Beth Hogan and I are trying to accomplish with what we call the place-based strategy in Central America. 5 or 6 years ago, I mean, I'll be quite clear with you, there was a period of time where Juarez had a homicide rate of about 180 per 100,000, and 200 yards across the river, El Paso had a homicide rate of 3.7 or something along those lines. Now, Juarez has become now, I mean, I won't call it the safest city in the world, but I believe they have brought their homicide rate down to somewhere in the 30s, and that is an astonishing accomplishment over 5 years. How have they done it? They did it with a version of what Beth and I would call the place-based strategy. Juarez city leaders and the federal government, in essence, did a grid of the map of Juarez, and in those troubled areas where the most homicides were occurring, they concentrated resources, not just police, although a lot of them were concentrated there, but also city and social services, employment generation, education, community centers, and in 5 years, Juarez has converted, I mean, it's literally been a complete turnaround. We would like to see that happening in San Salvador, in Guatemala City, in Tegucigalpa, and other cities in Central America as well. Drugs writ large, you know as well as I do, particularly coming from the El Paso area, it's a complicated issue. It's a supply issue and a demand issue. It is where the drugs are produced, which tends to be south of the border, and where they are consumed, which is north of the border. And then there's a variation. Bad news on heroin. It is surging. Cocaine, on the other hand, has dropped more than 50% in the United States of America. Is there a connection? Yes, there probably is. You are correct that in April of this year, all the governments of the world will meet in New York for a special session of the UN General Assembly where we will address where the world wants to go on drug policy for the next 20 years. And I, for one, am looking forward to a good conversation talking about realistic, pragmatic, logical steps that we could take that actually would bridge the gap between those who say legalize everything and the other extreme who say prohibit everything.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just want to say it's about time because we've lost in the black community a whole generation, maybe 2 generations of young African Americans as it relates to the lack of involvement and concern about the drug trafficking trade until, you know, unfortunately now too many other people are being victimized and hit by it. So I'm glad we're finally on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fartenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to share a story with you, which will become a quick admonishment, and then I want to turn to a question about gangs. Last year, we had a very lovely dinner hosted by the ambassadors from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And it was just a regularized attempt to create more ongoing relations between us and the diplomatic community. However, the dinner happened to be timed with the announcement from the administration that these countries were going to get $1 billion. So we walk into a very awkward situation of being thanked for something that we had not done, had not heard of, had not been briefed on. The point being, a lot of places in the world, when the president says something, when the Congress says something, that means it is. And so we were put in a very awkward position of gently working ourselves through that and saying, wait, time out. This has to be approved by Congress, and we want to know more details of the plan. So the admonishment is expectations can get created by things that are said that may not translate into reality because we have the job of actually coming up with the law that would mandate or dictate what you all do. So I put that on the table for your consideration. But it was fine. It was a lovely evening, and I think we got through this. Second, I want to know, give me your insights into gang culture. We throw the word around, gangs around. The mobility of this culture, where it primarily emanates from, clearly it's attached to drug trades, ungoverned space, corruption, habits of being, residual effects of past structures. I'd like more insights into this.
Thank you very much for your question. I'd like to start to answer that by saying that one of the things that we have benefited from while addressing gang culture is the work in the United States, particularly in Los Angeles and Chicago, where they have had great success in reducing gang violence. And one of the things that we have adapted from Los Angeles is something that's called the YSET model, and it's a series that helps one identify who are those children that are most at risk for joining gangs. And those are the kids that we are trying to focus on. We have a statistic that says that roughly 0.5% of people are responsible for 75% of crime.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because in a sense, this is a narrow band of persons who then sees the conditions that are ripe for manipulating others. And getting to the heart of that, I think, is the question for solving this. So
And
I'm
so
sorry
a couple of those indicators are things like, who are the kids who may have a family member in a gang? Who are the kids that are coming from broken homes? Who are the kids that have no parents at home after school and therefore,
But those are U.S. measures. In these places,
we're using them in Central America as well. And those are the kids that we're going after. And why we have these community outreach centers is to give a safe place for these kids to go after school, where they can get vocational training, they can have recreation activities, they can get tutoring, and they have mentors watching over them and giving them adult supervision that they don't otherwise have. And so we're seeing a reduction in the number of kids who go into gangs, as well as people coming out of gangs, because it's not a happy place to be. I mean, this is a very dangerous proposition for them. And so we have had example after example of kids who were maybe low-level gang members, maybe watch-outs, lookouts, and they have turned around to come to our centers because they don't want to follow in the footsteps of their brother, cousin, uncle who have been killed as a result of gang violence. And so I think, we're using a model that has been effective in the United States, and it's proving effective in Central America as well.
Thank you.
I'm hearing what you're saying. I also had concern because we were going in being congratulated with something we had not heard of. But before that happened, in meeting with the presidents of the three countries, after we had the situation with the unaccompanied children, we said, we want to help you. The last thing we want is to take your children, put them all over the United States, and I asked the question of each president in the country, do you want your children back? Because if they had not said yes adamantly, then our plan would have been different. But we said then, we're going to help you conquer the problems that would cause a parent to say, I'm going to give you my child to take to another country, and all I'm doing is paying you. It was a horrible thing as a parent to even consider. But when meeting with the presidents of those three countries, what concerned me is how unrealistic they were about what they wanted to do. Because they started with, we're going to have these Fortune 500 companies come to our country, and that'll put people to work. I said, not if they can't walk down the streets safely. So I was very pleased to hear that you had already done so much there, because it had to be that way. But we have to work with the governments of those countries to say, we're going to help, but there's going to have to be a lot of work on your end, and patience and real expectations.
And if I could just add, I think that intervention, the dinner, your engagement when the presidents came up in July of 2014, I think that helped catalyze their thinking that they needed a more comprehensive approach. And it led, through the efforts of the Inter-American Development Bank, to this creation of the Alliance for Prosperity. And the Alliance for Prosperity in Central America really is an historic opportunity moment for the United States, because it's the first time really that Guatemalans and Salvadorans and Hondurans agreed around the same set of circumstances and what the possible solutions could be. And the U.S., Congress's support in the FY16 bill to provide $750 million just doesn't make the United States a partner to this effort. It sends a signal to other partners in the hemisphere and around the world that this plan has a chance, and we will work with you, the Congress, on those conditions and help those countries live up to the commitments they've made in the Alliance for Prosperity.
Thank you. Mr. Rupersberger, you may have the last question.
Okay, thank. I want to talk about Zika, and the situation is becoming serious throughout the whole hemisphere. And in your roles, all three of your roles, we as a Congress have to decide how we're going to focus, how we're going to fund it. There's already a debate whether we're spending too much money or not. In your role in the region we're talking about today, it seems to me that you have to be involved in a lot of health issues, but this is something that is growing, and yet you have situations where I'm sure your health workers were being threatened and intimidated by gangs. So if you could talk about generally how your role will be in dealing with the issue of Zika, what you need from us, and what you would like to see from us if you could get that.
Yeah. I'll quickly give you the overview of how the department is approaching it. First, there is a whole of government, U.S. government approach to the Zika challenge writ large. In the region, the State Department is leading the diplomatic engagement, and we're working with organizations like the World Health Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, Health and Human Services, and the Center for Disease Control to make sure that we're getting information out to American citizens in the region, taking care of our employees at embassies who could be vulnerable to the virus, and working closely with the regional governments. And then finally, we are also working to ensure that there's the appropriate scientific exchange as we work to address this. And I'll turn to my AID colleague to talk about the programmatic elements.
Thank you very much for your question, and of course it's of very grave concern for us since it impacts Latin America so directly. We have been working with our counterparts in the region, in the ministries of health and elsewhere, to help identify what their needs are concurrently with what we might be able to provide. And certainly we can provide them with existing resources, help in developing public education campaigns on how to avoid contracting the disease and protective measures that people can take, particularly pregnant women can take, in order to lessen their vulnerability to this. We've only had one request for assistance thus far from the region. It came from Jamaica to help them improve their diagnostic testing, and that has been responded to through our support to the Pan American Health Organization. With additional resources, there's much more that needs to be done that we're poised to do, stimulating private sector research and development of better diagnostic tools, as well as a vaccine, supporting the training of health workers in the community to help affected countries with information about best practices and supporting children with microcephaly, to support pregnant women's health in particular, including helping them access repellent and to protect them against mosquitoes. As I mentioned, establishing education campaigns that will empower communities to take control of their actions. For example, limiting the amount of collected water that is a breeding ground for mosquitoes. And then potentially issuing a grand challenge, which is something that we do as a call to the world, basically, to provide innovative ideas for new ways in which they can, and improved ways in which we can develop diagnostics, vector control, personal protection, et cetera. It was through a similar through a grand challenge that we were able to develop the new Ebola suit that was something that was an innovation in the treatment for that disease. So this has that same potential as well going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. Following that up, let me ask a question, and it's Mr. Palmieri. Does the administration plan to use unobligated balances from Ebola to address Zika?
I know that there's a presentation that's been made on the administration's response to the Zika virus and the budget request. If I could get you the specific response to that question, I'll have it for you by the end of the day.
Yeah, that would be great. I thank the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. Members may submit any additional questions for the record. The Subcommittee on State Foreign Operation Related Programs stands adjourned. Thank you. Very good. It's very helpful.